Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the special speaker series of the Simpson Center for Food and Agricultural Policy. The topic of today's online event is Produce More, Emit Less, Strategies to Reduce Nitrous Oxide Emissions from Crop Production. My name is Brandy Yanchik, and I am an independent journalist and documentary filmmaker who is based in Edmonton, Alberta, which is in Treaty 6 territory. I'd like to acknowledge the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footprints have marked this territory for centuries, such as the Naheo, Cree, Dene, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Nakota Iska, Nakota Sioux, Niitsitapi, Blackfoot peoples. I also acknowledge this as the Métis homeland and the home of one of the largest communities of Inuit south of the 60th parallel. Before I begin today's panelists, a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you're having difficulties hearing the webinar at any time, or you are experiencing an unreliable internet signal, you can always use the call-in number included in your webinar registration email, or by clicking the arrow next to the microphone icon and pressing switch to phone audio. There is a box labeled Q&A. This is where you can pose your questions to the panelists. If you see a question in the Q&A box that you think is important to ask, you can also click the thumbs up icon on the question to move it to the front of the queue. We will also have a couple of poll questions for you. Today's event will consist of the presentations by our panelists, followed by some questions after each presentation. We will then have a panel discussion around the topic. Please be aware that this event is being recorded. The recording will be uploaded to YouTube, and you will receive the link in an email along with a post-event survey. We will be taking clips from the video and posting these on social media. We do hope that today's event promotes more discussion with a broad diversity of participants. Today, I am joined by three distinguished researchers for this discussion. Dr. Reynald Lemke is a research scientist in soil and environmental quality at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Dr. Mario Tenuta is a senior industrial research chair in 4R nutrient management and professor in soil ecology at the University of Manitoba. And Dr. Pelster is also a research scientist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, working on improving nitrogen fertilizer efficiency and mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from farm systems. Welcome. Before we begin, we have a poll question for the audience. Greenhouse gas emissions for each kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer use in Canada are A, one of the highest in the world, around world average, one of the lowest in the world. You have 1 minute to answer the poll, after which we will display the results. Okay, we have the answers. 21% of the participants think that greenhouse gas emissions for each kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer use in Canada are one of the highest in the world. 38% of the participants think that it is around the world average, and 41% think that these are one of the lowest in the world. Now I will briefly introduce the topic before inviting our distinguished speakers. In the 21st century, Canadian agriculture faces a defining mission: reduce greenhouse gas emissions, aim for net zero emissions by 2050, and still boost yields and the economy, all while nourishing a growing world. Crop producers in Canada not only feed Canadians, but also export to the world. 80% of our wheat production, 44% of canola, and 36% of barley, among many other crops, are exported to other countries. Fertilizers play a vital role in Canada's crops, boosting yields, exports, and assuring food security. Yet using nitrogen fertilizers releases the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide, N2O. The agriculture sector is the biggest contributor of nitrous oxide emissions in Canada. 76% of N2O emissions in Canada originate from the use of synthetic fertilizers. Today, greenhouse gas emissions from crop production stand at 19 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and 15 million tons of these are due to the use of fertilizer. This chart shows that the farm cash receipts from crops in Canada have been increasing over the last several years. As we produce more, we have been using more fertilizers. It is not only the farm revenues that have increased, but fertilizer-based emissions from agricultural soils also increased. Canada has set a national target to reduce absolute levels of greenhouse gas emissions arising from fertilizer application by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030, which is essentially a nitrous oxide reduction target. Although total emissions from crop production in Canada have been increasing since 2015, it is because there have been more production and more nitrogen fertilizer application. When seen as average emissions produced per kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer use, Canada is among the lowest emitters. Similarly, the average emission produced per hectare is also one of the lowest among comparative economies. We're going to discuss the strategies that can be adopted to meet the 30% N2O reduction target when we have little room to play with already low emission intensities. We'll discuss options for mitigating nitrous oxide emissions in Canada with a focus on Western Canada, effectiveness of different strategies that vary according to local environmental conditions, and lastly, mitigation strategies and technologies available, as well as barriers to adopting these strategies and technologies. I will now invite Dr. Reynald Lemke to start the discussion. As you listen to his presentation, can you please think of some questions that you'd like to ask him and put them in the Q&A box. In your question, please tell us your name and a bit about yourself, such as your location and your profession.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you to the committee for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Since I was the first up of the panel, I thought I would start with just a quick overview of the processes that we're talking about and how they sort of kind of fit into and interact with farm practices and where the mitigation opportunities might exist. So next slide, please. Soil-emitted N2O arises from microbial processes, arising mostly from nitrification and denitrification, sort of broad categories. The source of the N for these processes can be N released from decomposition of soil organic matter, crop residues, manures, other organic materials, but far and away, the largest source is synthetic fertilizers, either urea or ammonium anhydrous entering as you can see in the diagram there. If you advance one, please. And during the first step in this process, nitrification is the first place that we see N2O rising. Under ideal conditions for nitrification, those yields are generally pretty low. But as we get things unbalanced, for example, a high accumulation of ammonium, then the yields of N2O from nitrification can increase. Also, if we get high accumulations of ammonium at that point, there are other avenues of loss of volatilization of ammonia that's indicated there, which results in an indirect loss of N2O at a later point. Advance one, please. So once the nitrogen is moved to nitrate, and if soil conditions become on the wetter side or oxygen becomes limiting, then denitrification can kick in, and this is where we can have some very high emissions. There are 2 points where we really have to look at the potential to try and mitigate emissions. One is at sort of the ammonium point where ammonium may concentrate, and at the nitrate, and it's the confluence of these reactive endpoints under the right conditions that result in high losses. So advance one slide, please. So essentially, this is some ancient data here, but the story that the slide shows remains the same. So I drag this up every once in a while just because I'm lazy and don't want to create a new one. But if you put these things together on a seasonal basis for the Canadian prairies, the timing of the fluxes might look something like this, that you have two kind of peak periods. So right in the middle of the screen there of the slide, you can see an arrow which indicates where the fertilizer was applied. It was urea in this case. The dotted line at the top with the open circles shows soil water content. So you can say fertilizer was applied, not too much happened until soil water content increased. And so you get a period of high activity right around somewhere within a few weeks after seeding and fertilizing, and particularly, well, it will change depending on those conditions. The other point of high activity, you can see to the left of that slide, is right at snow melt and just following. And this is sort of the typical bimodal that we see. You know, it will vary from year to year, obviously depending on precipitation levels and et cetera. But this is kind of what we're looking at. So obviously, then those are the 2 points that we want to sort of focus on to try and reduce emissions, sort of the high peak periods. Next slide, please. So that was the generalized, sort of this confluence of reactive N and sort of soil conditions that kind of promote loss results in sort of this episodic events. It also results in some real differences across the landscape. So on an upper slope position, convex in particular, where soil water tends to shed soil water, emissions can be much lower than on the lower slope position, particularly in a convex position where soil water may accumulate. And so you can see there that these are sort of the cumulative loss that was measured from different slope positions at 2 different sites, one in the dark brown near Swift Current, the other near Mondaire, Alberta, which was in the black soil zone. The other point on this, I guess, is that you can see the differences between those 2 sites, that although fertilizer rates were not dissimilar, the loss at the Mondaire site, particularly in the lower slope position, was much lower. And so you get this distribution both geographically, depending on sort of soil environmental conditions, particularly the moisture regimes, as well as within the field variability. And so again, this may have implications for precision agriculture, particularly variable rate technology, and I'm sure the other panelists will explore that a bit further. Next slide, please. So going back to the peak activity that I was showing you in the previous slide, just at snowmelt or just after, it is a high point of activity for nitrous oxide emissions on the Canadian prairies frequently. And again, it varies very much year by year. But here I just pulled together some of the data that I had readily at hand. 36 comparisons of fall applied nitrogen and the N2O emissions resulting from that compared to spring applied nitrogen at the same rates. And there is, if you do a simple ratio of fall divided by spring, you can see that overall, in general, emissions are higher from the fall as compared to the spring application. And just a note at the bottom that out of the 36 comparisons, about 24 of those were showing higher emissions from fall, and the others were showing either similar or in some case reversal. So there's a lot of variability there, but overall it tends to be higher for fall than for spring. So one of the potential places where we can mitigate or avoid emissions, I guess, is sort of favoring spring application of nitrogen rather than fall application of nitrogen. Next slide, please. There's been a fair amount of work from a number of groups here. I just pulled together studies that I was involved in, and it's just a comparison of crop sequences, cereal wheat crop sequences in this case, compared to a pea wheat or a lentil wheat, comparing the cumulative N2O emissions, the direct emissions across the 2 years for the system that has with or without the pulse. And what I'm showing you on the slide there is the difference then in emissions, the percent difference between emissions from the wheat compared to the either pea wheat or lentil wheat in this case. So on the far left, you can see that at Swift Current, the lentil wheat had about 50% less direct N2O emissions than the wheat system compared head to head. Three Hills, Alberta, there's pea wheat there at 35% less, Scott 14% less, and so on. Over in the far right, you can see that lentil wheat in this case actually had an increase over those 2 years. So as with everything, there's a lot of variability in this, but in general, I think we're pretty comfortable that if you include a pulse crop or another biologically fixed crop that biologically fixes nitrogen into a system that was otherwise fertilized, a cereal oilseed, for example, you will result on a crop sequence basis in lower emissions. Next slide. And this is, I just sort of throw this in as a teaser. This is a single site in a single year, so you can't really draw any grand conclusions for it. But this study was one that I ran, and the results here, what we were trying to do was look for some of the choices that a producer might have readily at hand. We were changing fertilizer, et cetera. So we took a sort of what we thought was kind of the best management practice for the region. We had sites in Swift Current and Melfort. And here I'm just showing you the Swift Current site. And we tried to optimize row spacing, seeding rate, seeding date, and et cetera. So some of those management choices that a producer may have that under their ready control. And so we referred to those as the mitigation strategy. And you can see that in this case for canola, we actually got an improvement in seed yield and a reduction in N2O loss. And if you calculate that on a yield scale basis, in this case, grams per gram of dry matter or kilograms of dry matter, so the lower number is better. The mitigation strategy looks really good. On the spring wheat, on this spring wheat, the slide just moved away for some reason, but that's okay. Our yields were not better, but emissions were lower, and so the yield intensity was lower. So essentially, the point of that slide was simply that by working towards what we thought was sort of optimizing some of the other factors so that we could improve the end use efficiency or the end uptake of the fertilizer that was applied, on top of sort of good management strategies for the fertilizer, we could actually reduce emissions and or at least reduce the or improve the yield intensity. So the last slide was just a summary. I think I'm pretty much out of time. So just essentially, I guess what I tried to show you was a couple of opportunities, I think, where we can avoid emissions or reduce emissions, but trying to also make the point that it is a complex process with a lot of factors to consider as we move forward. So I will stop there.
Okay, Dr. Lemke, my question for you would be, would there be a difference in crop yields if fertilizer is applied in spring instead of fall? How do costs and benefits compare?
Well, in typical fashion, as a researcher, I'm going to say that depends. But there is, reasonably good data to show that from the agronomic perspective, in terms of the best efficient use of fertilizer, this spring generally outweighs fall application. In other words, fall application does not get as good a yield response. It's going to vary year by year. It's going to vary by location. So as with all of these things, it's sort of almost a probability distribution. But in general, I think it's safe to say that the spring application is more agronomically favorable. In terms of the actual costs and so on, I'm not sure that I can comment on that with credibility. There are a lot of things to consider. I mean, so from a strict agronomic perspective, it would seem like the most efficient. You're getting the best bang for your buck. There is the consideration, of course, that purchasing fertilizer in the fall sometimes can be done at a discount and so on. So, but as I said, how those numbers crunch through, I won't comment. Thanks.
Okay, I have another question for you, Dr. Lemke. Is 30% reduction a realistic target? Do the available strategies, if adopted on a large scale, have enough potential to meet the target?
So in short, yes, with a few caveats. So technically, I think we have tools available that if employed on, very good uptake, then it is possible to reach that goal. Not going to be easy, and I think it's certainly going to take sort of the collaborative effort of all levels, all groups within the sector, from producers up to researchers up to government or etc. So that we need to be working in the same direction in order to reach that. But technically the tools are there. I think we could get there. And as time moves along, there are more tools, I think, coming on stream that will be helpful.
Well, that's great. We're going to hear from our next two guest speakers now. There will be more time for audience questions at the end. So we're now going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Mario Tenuta.
Thank you, Brandy. I'm going to share my slides now. And I believe you are seeing my opening slide. Is that true, Brandy?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation to be here today and to speak with you all. I'm Mario Tenuta, a Senior Industrial Research Chair for Nutrient Management at the University of Manitoba in Treaty 1 territory, and as well coming from the home of the Métis Nation. So Dr. Lemke gave a really great overview on nitrous oxide emissions. I'm just going to reinforce that there are many options for farmers, and we package this as 4R nutrient stewardship, which is basically a decision-making approach to deciding what's the best way of using nitrogen for that particular field under those particular weather events, and what's available to the farmer in terms of machinery and products and so forth, and what they're growing. It's the right rate, choosing the right rate, time, source, and placement of the nitrogen fertilizer. And here I'm just showing some of the options available to farmers. If we're looking at the source or the type of fertilizer, it's the formulation or the chemistry of it. And then there's granule and liquid forms of nitrogen fertilizers. There can be additives to the fertilizer, such as inhibitors, and I'm going to show some benefits of those. And there could be coated fertilizer products, nitrogen fertilizer products that slow the release of nitrogen. We have many options under time. Dr. Lemke talked about fall versus spring. There's also before planting, at planting, after planting, and combinations of that. Then there's the right rate, which are based going from farmer experience, to much more sophisticated, which would be sensing the actual crop canopy in season and topping up fertilizer if needed, based on what the crop is telling us in terms of its nitrogen requirements. And then there's the placement. We can put the fertilizer with the seed, next to the seed, between seed rows. We can place it at the surface. We can place it subsurface in bands. We can put it on the surface of the soil, then cultivate and call that incorporated. And then when we do the subsurface banding, which is quite common in the prairies of Canada, there the farmers have a decision to place it shallow or close to the soil surface within an inch, or deeper, 3 inches or so. So many options there. So now you can imagine, as researchers, we have a plethora of options to examine. But the great thing is that this leads to options for farmers. And let's look at how we see the benefit of these different options. How do we study N2O? We do plot research there in the top left, and we monitor nitrous oxide. Here's an example in the top right with chambers that we can collect the N2O gas emitted from the soil underneath these chambers, and over the period of 30 minutes to 40 minutes, 60 minutes, determine the rate of increase in the nitrous oxide, and then determine the flux rate. The bottom right-hand corner is much more sophisticated. It's hands-off, and it gives us a field scale. Combined nitrous oxide emissions over a field, and that's using micrometeorological techniques. And here, flux gradient station at the Trace Gas Manitoba long-term research site. Lots of chambers, as you can see here, and then we'll have lots of graduate and summer students assisting in the field collecting samples. What do the results look like? Well, this is a figure that's showing nitrous oxide emissions. So as going up here, nitrous oxide emissions become higher, and this is 0 or nothing. And this is over time. And each dot here is a sampling day. And fertilizer here was provided at planting. There's urea fertilizer, it's granular fertilizer, and you can see there was a rainfall here after the planting, and the nitrification kicked in and produced nitrous oxide with urea. However, with an inhibitor of nitrification, which slows that transformation by bacteria of the urea and its ammonium content to nitrate, there is a lot less nitrous oxide emitted in purple there. And a product that is coated with a plastic polymer to slow or control the release of the urea through the coating into the soil. You can see there's a delayed release, and it happens much later in the season. And nothing very little at the beginning in terms of nitrous oxide, more as we get to early summer. Put this all together, this is still less than with the straight unprotected urea. But of course, in this trial, we can see that the nitrification inhibitor, the product was far superior. And another example with nitrification products, inhibitor products. Here's the urea comparison. Just look at the top panel here, and there's nitrous oxide emissions over the growing season, about 1 kilogram of nitrous oxide emitted with urea. And where there's a nitrification inhibitor in these two treatments, much reduced emissions. And so we're talking here about, in this case, about 50% reduction in emissions. Now, summarizing over our studies for Manitoba, and this is quite across Manitoba for many different crops in terms of field crops, vegetable crops, which would be potato, and then also legumes such as soybean or alfalfa or faba bean. The practices that we've looked at that have the highest reduction of nitrous oxide emissions is nitrogen fixing legumes. Makes sense. Dr. Lemke talked about inclusion of pulses in rotations in the prairie, reducing nitrous oxide emissions. And this is biggest practice we can do is nitrogen fixing legumes, be them grain or for forage, reduce N2O emissions drastically. There's split application then, which is reduced by 50%, and that's where some of the fertilizer nitrogen is added at time of planting, and then some is added during the growing season. So we've found this to be particularly effective in reducing nitrous oxide emissions, particularly with potatoes and with corn and with canola, which are all longer growing season crops than typical barley or wheat. Then the nitrification inhibitors at 30% nitrous oxide reduction, and close follow that is the polymer coated or the urea fertilizer products. Some products can actually, not products, some practices can increase N2O, such as fall application and shallow banding of fertilizer, and some don't do very much. But one thing that's really important here is look on the right side. Generally, the practices are not changing yield. So actually, that's a good thing in terms of we're not going backwards and decreasing yield. So that's a very good thing. The other thing that this is indicating is that our farmers are using decent practices and approaches to nitrogen management, and therefore by improving things, we're not, in terms of the nitrogen management, reducing nitrous oxide emissions, we're not seeing an effect on yield. So that's the situation for Canada, because our farmers are doing a good job in their management. We can improve the management for N2O reduction, but we're not going to be seeing a big yield boost increase. So what do we do in terms of adoption? We do have the ability to reduce nitrous oxide emissions and meet emission reduction targets. And was an example for Saskatchewan. There are options for farmers for cost sharing to use fertilizer products that reduce nitrous oxide emissions, such as the polymer coated urea or inhibitor nitrogen, develop nitrogen management plans, soil testing, soil mapping, and so forth. There's the Association of Watersheds, and then there's the Canola Council as well in terms of programs. It's called the OFCAF program. It's a great way to help pay for the practices to reduce nitrous oxide emissions if we're not seeing a yield increase. And here's some economics from a soil scientist, so be wary of the results. And what I've done is looked at because those fertilizers cost a bit more money than the straight urea. Well, this is an example for the brown zone of Saskatchewan, and assuming some assumptions here with spring wheat. And we would need to see an increase in yield. It doesn't have to be that much to pay back the premium for those fertilizers. Or the farmer can reduce the rate of nitrogen slightly to pay for the premium. And this makes sense to me, because if you're reducing losses, then you don't have to use as much fertilizer. If they use a carbon market, voluntary or regulated market, it doesn't work very well, because the price of the carbon needs to be exorbitant, over $600 a ton of CO2. And that's because the brown soil zone just doesn't produce all that much N2O. So the carbon credits from that reduction doesn't go very far. Now, using the OFCAF, or that subsidy program, cost sharing, that can go a long way in terms of covering the cost for the premium for the fertilizers. $5,000 and up, depending on the cost of the premium, the type of fertilizer used. So there are options to not lose money and still reduce nitrous oxide emissions. Moving forward, Reynald talked about landscape positions and affecting N2O. Well, this is a big area in terms of variable nitrogen rate and variable N source, where here the crest upper positions or crests of knolls in the field are in red, and green are depression areas. The losses of nitrous oxide are greater in those depression areas. And so we can put special fertilizers, inhibited fertilizer, for example, to reduce N2O emissions in the green. And we can also adjust the nitrogen rates across from upper to lower, depending on the productivity in those zones. So some areas we don't have to put as much fertilizer, and others we need to put more fertilizer. So we're tailoring within a field, and I'm calling this precision for our management. And this is just an example of a study that we've started with a producer north of Brandon, Manitoba, and with Crop Pro consulting company. And next year we're going to be extending that with colleagues at University of Saskatchewan and also at Indian Head Agricultural Research Foundation. Now, so far we've talked about nitrous oxide, nitrous oxide, nitrous oxide. There's a bigger picture here, and that's called indirect emissions. And there's ammonia that's lost from soil systems, and then there's nitrate leaching. There's greater opportunity here to reduce N2O emissions as well. A lot of 4R practices can reduce these losses of nitrogen, and but we need to study more the rates of these losses and the benefits of the 4R. So there's lots of greater opportunity here to go even beyond the 30%. With that, I'd like to thank you very much. My contact information is here in terms of an email, in terms of on, I guess this is old, it's not Twitter anymore, is it? It's X. I hate that, X. But or you can visit us at our homepage at soilecology.ca. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so Dr. Tenuta, we have a question from Karine Baning, and Karine is asking why the organic production was assessed only for 2 years, please.
That's how much funding I had. So we could only we need money to do the studying. What we've done is with organic agriculture, it becomes a little tricky because the nitrogen addition is in the form of a green manure plow down, and so we covered that green manure growing, and then its incorporation, and then the following year in terms of crop production of the wheat. And we basically covered the cycle in terms of the nitrogen producing years and then the grain producing years. And so we want to follow up with more studies on that. It's interesting, that study, the results were variable. In 1 year, the organic system produced a lot less N2O, but in the next year, it produced more, much more, and it was because of the rain. And it made sense overall because we're still adding nitrogen with organic systems, and actually adding more nitrogen was being added in the organic system than in the conventional. So when that residue was activated by water, by rains, we had the greater potential for more N2O emissions with the organic than the conventional. So which brings up a great point. Thank you for bringing this up, that the 4Rs need to be applied to organic systems just as well as conventional. And there's a lot of room on the organic to improve and reduce N2O emissions.
Okay, so we have one more question. If you can answer this quickly, from Will, please. Will is asking, with respect to the varieties of right fertilizer sources, what types of placement and application method have been tested?
Well, for our group and colleagues across Canada, the major nitrogen sources available to farmers have been tested: anhydrous ammonia, urea, and then UAN. And then we're related with that are the inhibitors, the main inhibitor products, so which that would be with urease inhibitors, and then urease and nitrification inhibitors, and then the controlled release products, which would be like ESN with polymer coated. And then for placement, you name it, surface application left on the surface, scratched in or incorporated in, and then banded, such as side banded or mid-row banded. And then we've been looking at the depth of that banding. So quite a few combinations there.
Fantastic. Thanks for answering those questions from the audience. And we love hearing from you. So please remember, if you hear something exciting that you want to be asked, to put it in the Q&A box. We're going to continue the discussion with the experts in our panel discussion. Again, we will reserve time for more questions at the end. But for now, it's time for our next speaker, Dr. David Pelster, to share his insights. Thank you.
All right, thank you. My name is David Pelster. I'm a scientist in Ottawa. I'm originally from Edmonton. So yeah, I know probably, yeah, and I just moved to Ottawa. So hopefully I'll get things figured out here a little bit. But we go to the next slide. My presentation is going to be a little bit different from the previous ones. I'm not going to be presenting any results yet. I haven't really been in Ottawa. I haven't really been in Ottawa for too long. I'm still kind of setting up the program here. So I'll kind of talk a little bit more about some other studies that we're planning on doing in the future and that we're working on. One thing that I want to say is I've heard, talking with farmers, and a lot of people say they're really worried about fertilization rates and being forced to reduce fertilizer. I think it's more, and maybe I'm projecting a bit, but I would guess that they're more worried about their yields and their profitability than they are about the actual fertilizer rates. And I just wanted to show with this slide here, if we're talking about fertilizer rates, in general, a good chunk of that fertilizer is lost. So I just want to show that there is options for improving nitrogen use efficiency. So, improving how efficient that is and reducing the losses. And that does not have to come, it doesn't have to come at the cost of losing yields as well. There's enough losses out there that if we can reduce those losses, we should be able to still maintain or possibly even increase yields, even at lower fertilization rates. It will take a bit of know-how and a bit of work, but I think it is feasible. So next slide. One of the things that I noticed, I went through when I first was contacted, there's a nice report by the Simpson Center where they talk about the 30% target. And one of the things that they talk about is limiting our ability to reach that target is how well we can actually account for these. And this is something that I am starting to work on, because to actually account for these reductions, so we know that we're reaching our target or not, we really need to do better in knowing what the farmers are doing, what practices they're using, and on how much land they're doing those practices. We also need to know what these different practices, how much they reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And that's, you could see that some of the practices seem to result in reduced emissions, and you could see that in some of Reynald's work and some of what Mario presented. Next slide. But basically the work that Reynald's doing, the work that Mario's doing, I have a bunch of projects on it as well, and there's a number of other researchers across the country working on it. We're working on trying to figure out what the reductions can be with different management systems, but we still need to know what the farmers are doing. And right now, I don't know if it's being done that well. Agriculture Canada, we've kind of addressed that, or not. We're in the process of addressing it. We've accepted that the farm management survey, tracking overall fertilizer sales, the census, is not the most effective way of figuring out what farms are doing. So we have ongoing work to improve that. So we're working on reviewing the farm management survey. We're trying to get better data in terms of how much enhanced efficiency fertilizers are being sold, for example, trying to get better data on where and how much that's being applied. to which fields, to which crops, etc. And all of that is being done right now. We're trying to use machine learning to actually develop predictive models so we know better what fertilizers are being applied where. And then we're also working on trying to use Earth observation data, so satellite information, and using that as proxies so we can figure out what the farmers are doing, year by year rather than, every couple of years as is the case in the farm management survey and the census data. So that's kind of half the picture. The other half the picture is figuring out, trying to take all the studies from across Canada, from what Mario's doing, from what Reynald's doing, and other researchers across Canada. Next slide. And to do that, we have sort of a summary, like a summary or meta-analysis that we're working on right now. So we've sort of developed or accumulated a database with about 1,600 points of data from across Canada. So about 60% of that is from the prairies. A good chunk of the rest is from Eastern Canada. We don't seem to have many studies in BC, which could be a problem if you're trying to develop reductions or trying to account for the reductions in British Columbia. I mean, the farmers, they'll still do their practices and probably reduce the emissions, but unless we get more studies where we can actually measure what those changes, what those management changes mean in terms of emissions reductions, it's very difficult for us to account for those reductions in the actual inventory, which we then have to submit to the IPCC. So from this database, we have a lot of data on, comparing conventional fertilizers to enhanced efficiency fertilizers. We have, quite a number of studies on organic fertilizers, so manures, composts, digestates, and that sort of stuff. So we can probably come up with a pretty good idea in terms of what the reductions will get across Canada in different ecoregions, different, parts of the country. And so we are working on that so we can actually account for what the farmers are doing. That's actually a really big priority for us right now, because without being able to account for all of the practices and changes that farmers are doing, we can't actually prove it, which we also need to do we need to prove that we can actually do what we're saying we're doing. Some of the other work that I'm doing in terms of field studies, if you want to move to the next slide again. It's like similar to what Mario and what Reynald, what they're doing. We're doing a bunch of field and lab measurements. We're trying our best to include winter. I've realized, growing up on the prairies, winter was really cold, but typically fairly dry when compared to Eastern Canada. So doing the chamber measurements that Mario talked about, and you can see in the picture on the right side in the center. Doing the measurements through winter is much more difficult in Eastern Canada, because especially coming from Quebec City, where you get 3 meters of snow on average, trying to make sure that those chambers don't get buried under a snowdrift was a fair bit of work. But I mean, winter is fairly important. You could see, if you remember in Reynolds' slide, he showed what happened when the snow melts. We have previous study where we found that about 36% of your emissions happen during the winter, so it is an important time. Some of the other work that I'm doing as well, though, is again, looking at inhibitors. They seem to be sort of the one way that, sort of an easier way to reach that 30% target. They seem to be quite promising as a technology. We also are working on looking at what we can do with cover crops to reduce emissions, playing with different types of tillage, making the rotations a little bit more complex than just, in the East, corn and soy are very important. And then, digestates, manures, trying to use some of the organic sources as well. And we have a bunch of studies where we're comparing all of these. Unfortunately, they're they're all just kind of starting up, so I don't have any data to show. Next slide. We also have a flux tower site, and this is similar to what Mario was showing. And this one, with the chambers, you get sort of very small. You know, you're measuring the emissions on a very small scale in terms of time or in terms of space. Usually those chambers are, you know, at most like half a meter by half a meter. These flux towers, though, you can get sort of you know, the emissions off an entire field, and it's sort of a weighted average across that field. So you can actually look at a much bigger scale and get a better idea. So we have a study ongoing with that as well, where we're looking again at dual inhibitors, and we want to look at a little bit of a rate reduction. Again, this is all sort of what's ongoing, so I don't have any data to share, but we are doing this as well. Next slide. And then some of the other research that we're looking at doing. So biological nitrification inhibition, this is instead of using inhibitors like synthetic inhibitors, there's a bunch of plants out there that can actually inhibit nitrification just through what they release from their roots. And there has been work to get that genetics into wheat. And there's actually commercial wheat varieties not available in Canada yet. They were developed in Mexico, so obviously that won't work in Canada. But the Mexican varieties, they found that it's actually reduced emissions by about 25%, and that's, you know, all other management is the same. So that seems like a pretty promising technology. So we're working on bringing that in. We have projects where we're working with a company where they have real-time soil nitrate sensors, which they are trying to use in with fertigation in potatoes. So you can actually know how much soil nitrate there is in real time, and you can adjust the amount of nitrogen that goes into your irrigation water, and then sort of address the nutrient needs in real time. Next slide. And then other technologies that are out there that, and this is more, now this is probably more for the net zero in 2050, because this is sort of a longer timeline. But people are, you know, I've heard people talking about using N-fixing cereals. There's perennial cereal crops as well. So you plant them 1 year and then they keep growing back for, you know, 2-3 years, and then you have to sort of take them out and grow something else for a year or two. But that the perennials tend to have lower nitrogen yields or lower nitrogen needs than some of the annual crops, so that should be able to reduce emissions as well. And then there's also a number of companies out there that are starting to sell free living soil, like bacteria that can fix N, and you know, you could apply that in the place of fertilizer. And from what I've heard in contact and talking with some of these companies, some of these bacteria that you apply, they'll fix about 40 kilograms of nitrogen per year for you. So you can apply that instead of your fertilizer. So, and that's the next slide, which I think is my final slide. So that's it for me. So thank you, and I guess questions.
I have a question for you from someone in the audience who's anonymous. Is there concern about using fertilizers coated with polymers, considering some of the studies done on microplastics in water?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I would, because there has been a number of people, like just health related studies where they found issues with microplastics and that. I'm not entirely sure how much discussion there's been in terms of the polymer coated, plastic coated fertilizers, but I would imagine if it's not an issue, it probably will be. But there's not a lot of studies linking those. That's something we can look at in the future. So. But yeah, I'm honestly not the person to talk to about you know, judging the concern and microplastics. I'm not a social scientist, nor am I working on microplastics in water. So, but yeah, sorry.
Okay, I have another question for you. This one is from Erica. Can you give examples of nitrogen fixing cereals?
At this point, no. But it would, I mean, there is talk of people, you know, taking, like, using genetic modification technologies to transfer that ability from legumes into cereals. But as far as I know, it has not been done yet. Yeah, but I mean,
Okay, now we're going to move on to a panel discussion. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Pelster, for your presentation. So I have a question here, a few questions prepared for the panel discussion, and if there's time at the end, we'll take another couple of questions from the audience as well. So please put those in the chat and upvote the ones that you'd like to see our panelists address. So the first question is for Mario. We want to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, but do not want to reduce food production. One way to do this is using fertilizer more efficiently by adopting 4R practices. But can farmers readily adopt these so that it does not negatively impact their farm revenues? Is economics a barrier to adopting some of the best practices that we discussed today? And again, that's for you, Mario.
Economics is always a consideration, and in terms of as a barrier, in many cases it is. That's because some of the practices and technologies that has been discussed today come with extra costs above what farmers are doing at the moment. So some practices do not come at an extra cost, and some of the practices can be adopted and replace previous practices and approaches, and cropping or choice of crops and choice of the nitrogen requirements then based on the crop can vary, and farmers can keep their bottom lines the same depending on market for the crops. So it's a big question, but if we take some examples like the enhanced efficiency fertilizers, and particularly the polymer coated fertilizer and the inhibited fertilizers, as I discussed, they have a dollar premium with them, and that premium will have to be recovered, or else the farmer will be losing profit. They won't be losing money so much, but they'll be cutting into their profit. And so there's 4 options that the farmer can tap into to not lose the profit. And depending where you are, let's say, for example, if you're in Ontario, working the carbon market can work very well because you don't need as much of a price on carbon on the market in terms of dollars per ton of CO2, because the emissions of nitrous oxide are just much more higher in agricultural land in Ontario. So there, a carbon market is available. So if they, for example, a Ontario farmer was to use a carbon market and then use the off-calf program, and then if they were also to reduce their nitrogen rates because they're reducing their loss of nitrogen, actually they're going to come out making way more money. And prairie farmers can do a bit of a mix of, it's tough maybe in eastern Manitoba. The carbon markets might be quite viable, but other areas the emissions are too low. But there's the off-calf cost sharing program and changing nitrogen rates. In those combinations, they could actually be increasing their profits. So in a nutshell, I think there's a great opportunity there. Now, we always think of the negative. It costs more, but actually there are so many options now available that the farmers can actually make more money on this, and it's not because of yield increase.
Okay, so David, do you want to share any thoughts on this question as well?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, yeah, I've had this discussion with Mario before, and I mean, when it comes to profits and that, I mean, again, I'm not the person to talk to, but in general, a lot of these practices are designed to reduce not only nitrous oxide emissions, but reduce your nitrogen losses in general. And there's other pathways for nitrogen losses. There's nitrate leaching, there's ammonia volatilization, there's nitric oxide, which can be lost, and then there's nitrogen as well, like nitrogen gas. So there's lots of loss pathways, and a lot of these strategies are designed to reduce those losses. And if you're reducing the losses, your crop should be fine with slightly lower rates. Now that still requires a bit more research to make sure, but I mean that's something that farmers can do too. They can, go through and try some of these practices, and if they're not seeing a yield increase the next year, try reducing the rates a little bit. And you don't have to do it on the entire farm. Do like a couple strips at the normal rates, a couple strips at a lower rate, and they can do these sorts of things themselves and see what the practices do. If they see a yield increase, then fine. The reductions in losses are probably resulting in better yields. But if you're not seeing that yield increase, start playing with the rates.
Okay, and Reynald, do you have any comments for this question? I also have a question coming up for you, but just in case you want to add something here.
Not so much. I think Mario and David handled that rather nicely. I mean, it's not an easy answer to give a single answer to, but I think just my only comment is really to reiterate. I mean, if we're focusing on the 4R, we're focusing on fertilizer use efficiency, which farmers are wanting to do and needing to do in any case, then at least theoretically, those same options should result in lower emissions. So, so you're trying to really fine tune this, I guess, is what it comes down to. And so essentially trying to come up with a collection of tools for their toolbox that they can apply based on their own operation, that can at least maintain yields and hopefully at the same time reduce emissions. So, yeah.
Okay, so my question for you, Reynald, is there are so many factors that you mentioned in your talk that affect nitrous oxide emissions, such as topography, soil texture, irrigation, and fertilizer application methods. And these factors vary from farm to farm. How can each farmer know what's the best combination of practices for their farm? Does each region or farm need a separate recipe of best practices?
I don't think. How do I respond? So I guess from my perspective, at least, the approach that I've been trying to view this through is we're trying to provide options, and as many options as possible, and as much information about how to understand those options, how they interact with farm practices. So I don't think there is a recipe that could be provided. Every operation is unique, and as you say, even within a specific operation, there are lots of variability from field to field, within the field, and so forth. So I guess first of all, I think producers are really good at understanding how their operation works. If we can provide, some effective tools and some good information around how they might fit into their particular operation, then it really comes back to the producer to pick up those tools, I guess, where it makes sense and employ them. So yes, there is lots of variability, and there's going to have to be adjustments at regional as well as individual operation levels. But I guess my approach, and I think it's the same for all of the research, is what we're trying to come up with is what are the options that they could possibly consider using, and then enough information around those so that the producers can decide whether it fits or how it might fit into their specific circumstance.
Okay, so Mario, do you want to add anything here to this question?
It's field by field, it's farm by farm. Driven, that's the thing about 4Rs, is that it's adaptable, and it's not meant to be a prescription, because it needs to be flexible. And even within a farm, it needs to be flexible because of the weather. Okay, so some cases it's challenging to get the nitrogen on in the springtime. Sometimes it's challenging to put it on according to the best management practices for the prairies, which would be subsurface banding. Sometimes that's a challenge, and farmers have to float their fertilizer, put it on broadcast, and leave it at the surface, which we know is not a good BMP. But the 4Rs can adjust for that, and in many cases can compensate by changing the product of the nitrogen to reduce the ammonia volatilization, for example. So the key thing is that flexibility, know what the options are. And I think the other, and it was mentioned here, was on-farm testing, was experiment. Experiment on farm with strips, with farmers now with yield monitors, and being able to regulate nitrogen rate applications. And with the GPS abilities, it's very easy for farmers to set up their own strip trials. And we advocate that to learn and to fine tune those nitrogen rates.
So, David, I have a question for you, but I don't know if you want to add a little bit to this question.
I mean, Reynald and Mario addressed most of it. I mean, the thing is, yes, there's a lot of spatial variability. There's a lot of temporal variability. I think what we're trying to do is create tools, and give the farmers the information that they need, and they're the ones on the ground. They're the ones who know their fields better than anyone, and they're the ones that are going to make the decisions, and we just need to give them the tools.
Fantastic. Okay, so David, here's your new question. You mentioned the need to update how we measure emissions from better nitrogen systems. Without this new data and a better way to see how well our best farming practices are working, we can't track our progress or encourage people to use these methods. So how much progress have we made in updating data and methods?
Yeah, the last inventory was based on a paper that came out in 2018, I think. And it's been 5 years. We've actually done a fair bit of new experimentation in those 5 years. There's been a lot more research done, particularly on inhibitors, because that, like I said, that seems to be a fairly promising technology for reductions. So we're working on the meta-analysis to try to summarize all that new data into something that we can then transfer to the National Inventory Group here, so they can start accounting for these different management practices. Yeah, I mean, we're hoping to have something out in the next year, but that would be a scientific publication, and then it would take a little bit of time before it actually gets into the inventory. But that's just on the side of the emission factors, so how these practices affect emissions. Because you also ask, I think, about are we able to track the practices and how much the practices are changing? And that's a different group, but I know there's people working on that. I can't quite say how much progress there's been on that. I know there's been discussion with Stats Canada about the, changing the way the farm management survey is done to better, give us better information, or give them better information in terms of what farm practices are being used. You also mentioned we can't track our progress or encourage, encouraging people to make those changes. And when it comes to encouraging people, I mean, I have no idea. I mean, yeah, encouraging farmers to make the changes. I mean, we talked a little bit about economics. That could be one way, but I'm sure there's multiple ways to do it. And I'm sure I know we have people with the AFC who are working on, developing those sorts of policies, but what they're planning or what they're working on, I don't know.
Okay, so my other question here is for all of you. You can just jump in and comment as you please. The question is there a need for personalized advice to help farmers choose the right strategies for reducing N2O emissions on their farms, considering their unique circumstances? Would it be a good idea to bring back extension services to provide this kind of guidance? Feel free to jump in.
I'll wave in first. Is it good to bring back extension services to assist with this? Of course, it would be phenomenal. I would, and not only for this, but for disease management, for soil health, for all kinds of things. Is it going to happen? Likely not. It was just we've moved away from the particular extension, government supplied extension, and moved now towards commodity supplied or farmer supplied or industry supplied or consultants, paying for consultants. So I see that there's a big room, and I tell this to students, so there's a big room for need for smart people that know how to fill out the paperwork, nutrient management plans, fill out estimates of reductions of nitrous oxide emissions based on practices and so forth, and help navigate the paperwork for funding programs, navigate potentially for carbon credit programs and so forth like that. So yes, there is a huge need for this space, and you're going to see it as a really big growth area in the agricultural sector in terms of a provision of services. Yeah, that's I think it's going to be economics that's going to drive that, and it's going to be through that actually it's going to make farmers more money, and then they're going to enlist those services.
Anybody else want to jump in on this one before I move to the next question?
I'm a soil scientist, right? So I'm focused straight down at the ground most of the time. So we get into policy or economics, I'm off the trail in short order. But I think really the knowledge and information provision and sharing is really a key here. That they're saying before, producers are very good at managing their farms, managing their fertilizers, managing their crops, and etc. When we're looking at N2O reduction, there's, it's a slight twist, I guess, on what they're already doing, and they would need some really good information about, how to apply that in that respect. So clearly, I think, the knowledge sharing is important. Obviously, if we had people dedicated to providing that, that would be great. But the reality of that probably is not going to happen. So.
Okay, I have another question here. This is from the Q&A box. This is for you, Reynald. It's from Ryan Barrett. He is writing, I am curious about substantial nitrous oxide emission reductions when incorporating legumes. In these trials, how are growers advised to reduce applied nitrogen? Here in Prince Edward Island, we lack good data on nitrogen credits to inform producers on how much they can reduce nitrogen without impacting yield. But something of high interest importance here. There's your question.
My response would be yes, we are lacking in that information, particularly in different regions of the country. So I mean, reducing emissions at the rotation level by including crops that fix their own nitrogen, biologically fixed nitrogen, we know that that's going to be successful in terms of, I mean, essentially you're avoiding at least commercial fertilizer application for 1 year. And emissions during the crop phase where they're fixing their own nitrogen emissions generally are similar to background. So, you know, and that's without sort of if we're just talking about direct emissions, I guess. If you're not applying fertilizer for 1 year of your rotation, you're also avoiding some of the emissions associated with production, transport, and all of that. In terms of the end credit, that is definitely a more difficult question. We've wrestled with that for years. I don't have a good answer for that. I think it's a gap that we need to really focus on, and that the answer to that is going to vary by region. So you're going to need some good research. I guess that's all I can say. I'm open to comment from my esteemed colleagues.
I just like Reynald, you kind of touched on, you know, 1 year of having these end fixing crops means 1 year that you don't apply synthetic fertilizers, and you kind of touched on the emissions from related to production of fertilizer, transport, and everything else. And I think that's something that we haven't really talked about so much, but the latest number I saw in terms of how much, you know, greenhouse gases are produced through the production of nitrogen fertilizers, that's 1.4 of all anthropogenic emissions is production of nitrogen fertilizer, which is more than I think, I'm not sure exactly how much Canada does in terms of global emissions, but you know, it's a really large amount, 1.4%. And if we can do things to reduce the synthetic fertilizers, I think, you know, you can start bringing that number down as well. Like not only your emissions from the application, but start reducing the emissions from the production as well, and transport obviously. But I mean, those all kind of, you know, roll into each other.
Okay, so I have a question for Mario from the audience. This person's going under anonymous, but this is what they are asking. How do you rank all the strategies that we discussed today in terms of their potential for emission mitigation and yield improvement?
Right. So we have to be careful about this in terms of, you can take it from two angles. You talk about what reduces emissions the most based on studies, and then what would reduce emissions the most under realistic adoption levels. Okay, so they're two different things, right? Right off the bat, you know, we've talked about it. Grow legumes. If everybody was to eat beans, we would be, you know, lentils, beans, peas, and stuff like that. We'd be doing really good, but that's not going to happen, right? Partly because our methane emissions will go way up. But anyway, besides that, that was a joke, by the way. Realistically, you know, the inhibitors, because farmers are using synthetic fertilizers, and it's a big portion of the nitrogen budget that we had, and they're used to the technology, and it pays off. And if we can do something to reduce N2O emissions from that use, we have a big net result in terms of reductions in N2O. So that one's really clear. If we talk about things, let's say like shifting from fall to spring application, we know that reduces N2O emissions, but in some places that's not practical because the farmers need to apply in the fall for a number of reasons. And then there's economic incentives for buying the fertilizer in the fall. And then in some regions where we're moving lots of nitrogen all at one time, we don't have the capacity to move all that nitrogen in the spring at planting. We need to spread that movement out into the fall and the spring because of transportation, logistics, storage logistics, and so forth. So I hear this all the time, particularly from the federal government, from the bureaucrats saying we're gonna, you know, we should stop fall application. And you know, those that know something about the agronomy say that's never going to happen. I'm sorry, for some areas of the prairies, because it doesn't make any practical sense. It needs to happen. And so I would say the inhibitors is one. The next is going to be the timing, placement. The rate is going to be a very big one. And there we need to really be innovative. And so we heard about sensing the soil for potato fertigation. Canopy sensing as well can be done. Split application based on the sensing. So some people are talking about satellite, trying to use satellites that would be ultra convenient. And then there's going to be precision approaches. And then people are thinking about machine learning and artificial intelligence, particularly when you start talking about having sensors and yield monitors and so forth, and whether you can start incorporating that in. So those are the biggies. There's a few biggies on the horizon here until that's going to probably bide us time until we have David's nitrogen fixing cereals. And then we're going to start having, the game is going to change.
Okay, so we love getting these questions from the audience. We have one from Paul. Anyone can answer this, so just jump in. The question from Paul is, have you looked at reductions in N2O from better water management in dry land or irrigation? And then in brackets, he wrote, reducing soil saturation through things like better drainage or variable rate irrigation techniques. Anyone can jump in here.
I'll jump in, not very far. I'm going to say, no, we haven't looked into it. Have we thought about it? Absolutely, yes. Will it, does it have potential to reduce emissions? Yes. So particularly, for example, here in Manitoba, we have a lot of areas that are problematic for wet soils, wet saturated soils. So a big problem becomes where, for example, a farmer is committed their nitrogen application, because of rains and so forth, then we start having portions of the field that are unproductive. So now you have N2O emissions from unproductive areas, but now you have nitrogen that's been applied to an area that has not taken, a crop won't come off from it. And then those areas are unproductive, and then they're reducing the carbon in the soil. So we may be losing organic matter in the long term if these areas are repeatedly. So there's the nitrous oxide reductions, because as Reynald was showing, as the moisture goes up to a point, you get more N2O emissions. But we also get impact on productivity, and then that's going to impact then carbon in soil or carbon return from the crop. So yes, Paul, great thinking, and you got to push us to go in that direction.
Okay, so we have one last question here that I'd like you to answer quickly because of the time. Anybody can answer this. You can all jump in. What agricultural technology looks to be the most helpful to reduce nitrous oxide emissions in Alberta?
Okay, maybe I'll take that, or Reynald, if you want to go ahead, but I'll start. I mean, for me, like, you think about Alberta, there's, what's there? You got a lot of canola, you have a lot of wheat. The nitrification, or the dual inhibitors, so urease nitrification inhibitors, I think, is a promising technology for reducing emissions. Like Mario said, it doesn't require many changes in terms of how the farmer, what the farmer does. It doesn't require new equipment, doesn't require anything like that. Like it's applied the same way. So it's something easy. There's a little bit of a cost difference there. So, us as researchers, we need to be able to show either that it's going to give them a yield increase, or they can, reduce their application rates a little bit, or find some way so that they can maintain profitability. But for me, that's a big one. I still think the wheats, the biological nitrification inhibition, so actually breeding that ability into the plants. And from where I'm standing, we're probably about 8 to 9 years away. We're starting the breeding in Canadian wheat. We're going to be starting that breeding program soon, probably in the next year or so. So it'll take a while before those actually go to market. But for me, again, it's something that doesn't require any changes by the farmers. It's just a new type of seed that, hopefully when it's made commercially available, it'll be able to, produce the same amount with lower losses and lower application rates. But again, it doesn't require new equipment by the farmers, any new sort of treatments. So for me, those two could be big for Alberta. It just, if you look at where we're at, the inhibitors are something that they can do now, whereas the biological nitrification is something that we're hopeful could come out in the next 10 years or something.
Okay, so thank you to everybody for your participation today and your thoughtful questions. Now let's finish with a poll question. And the poll question is, after hearing today's discussions, do you feel there's need to be more of a regional approach to communicating the effectiveness of emission mitigation strategies to farmers and informing policy making based on that regional diversity? Yes, no, or maybe. You have 1 minute to answer the poll, after which we will display the results. We have the results. Okay, so 82% of the participants say yes to adopting a regional approach to communicating the effectiveness of these strategies to farmers. 3% of the participants say no, and 16% say maybe. Well, we've had a fantastic discussion today. So much information to think about. Thank you to Reynald, Mario, and David for sharing all of your knowledge with us today. And to our participants, you'll receive a post-event survey and a registration link for the next special speaker series on reducing methane emissions from cattle production. Please also go to the simpsoncenter.ca website and subscribe to hear more about upcoming events and receive our monthly newsletter for information based on research about Canadian food production. Thank you very much for joining us today.